The rain had been coming down in steady, silvery sheets all evening, streaking the black-tinted windows of Ethan Cole's sleek town car as it rolled through the quieter part of downtown. He'd left the last meeting of the day with an ache behind his eyes, the kind that came from too many contracts, too many numbers, and not enough air. The chauffeur asked if he wanted to head home, but Ethan shook his head. He needed something hot to eat and a moment away from his penthouse's hollow silence. The glowing red letters of Marty's Diner caught his attention, a place he hadn't stepped into in more than a decade, back when it was the only spot open after midnight for him and his college friends. Tonight, it looked smaller, older, but somehow more inviting than any of the five-star restaurants he owned partial shares in. He slid into a corner booth, the leather cracked from years of use, and absently ran his finger along the chipped edge of the table while glancing at the laminated menu. He heard the faint clink of cutlery and the low hum of an old jukebox in the back, a quiet backdrop to his thoughts. Then came the sound of soft footsteps approaching. "Coffee?" A voice asked, low and professional. He looked up, and the air in his chest stilled. Lena. The name thundered in his head before he could stop it. She wore the pale blue uniform of the diner, her dark curls pulled back under a simple hair tie, a small silver locket at her neck that he remembered buying her one summer in Nantucket. But his gaze caught on the gentle curve of her stomach beneath the apron, unmistakably pregnant. Her face didn't betray any of the shock he felt. Her expression was cool, almost detached, like he was just another customer on a rainy Tuesday night. "Ethan," she said finally, his name tasting different in her mouth now, less like a memory, more like a fact. He couldn't find words. She poured the coffee without waiting for an answer, the rich aroma filling the space between them, and then she was gone, walking toward another table with the same practiced grace. He sat frozen, his mind scrambling to connect the woman he'd once promised forever to, the woman he'd left in a haze of pride and unfinished arguments, with the one now moving quietly between tables, serving strangers as if he weren't even there. The diner's warmth suddenly felt suffocating. He could hear his own heartbeat over the muted diner chatter, could feel the years between them pressing down like a physical weight. Questions tore through him. About the baby, about where she'd been, about whether she'd been happy without him. But beneath them all was something he couldn't quite name, something that made his chest tighten and his throat go dry. The simple, undeniable truth that seeing her again was going to change everything. Ethan stayed in that booth far longer than necessary, his coffee cooling untouched, as if the dark liquid might somehow steady the storm in his head. Every time Lena moved across the diner, he found himself tracking her without meaning to. How she balanced plates on one arm like she'd done this her whole life, how she smiled politely at strangers, but never looked him in the eye. It was almost easier when she was across the room, when she came close enough for him to hear the faint lilt in her voice or catch the scent of her, vanilla and something floral. Memories began spilling in uninvited. He saw her again in a white dress beneath blooming cherry trees, the way she laughed during their first dance, how she used to rest her head on his chest when they stayed up too late, whispering about the future. But along with the sweetness came the sting. Their shouting matches that rattled the walls of their apartment, the slammed doors, the accusations. He remembered the night he walked out, telling himself it was for the best because they were too different, because she deserved someone who could give her stability. But stability had been an excuse, a shield for his pride and the gnawing fear that love wasn't enough to keep them from tearing each other apart. Now, watching her serve coffee to a truck driver with a tired smile, he felt a hollowness he didn't recognize, regret stripped of the armor he'd worn for years. He tried to picture her life, since then, the man who had given her the child she carried. Whether that man had cherished her in ways Ethan never could, or whether he had left her to stand here on aching feet for hours at a time. The thought made his jaw tighten. It was a strange mix of protectiveness and jealousy, made more complicated by the fact that she had once been his, and he had let her go. He had built an empire since then, offices in 3 cities, a penthouse overlooking the skyline, a collection of watches worth more than most people's cars. But sitting in that booth, he'd never felt smaller. Wealth could fill closets and bank accounts, but it couldn't reach into the empty space she had left. He realized, with an uncomfortable pang, that he didn't just miss her, he missed the man he had been when he was with her, before success hardened him into someone who measured worth in quarterly earnings and property values. And the truth he kept circling back to, no matter how he tried to push it away, was that seeing Lena here wasn't just a reminder of their past. It was a mirror showing him every choice that had led them to this moment, and everyone he wished he could take back. The diner had thinned out by the time Ethan finally forced himself to move. He waited until Lena was clearing a table near the front, her back half turned, before standing and walking toward the counter. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the hiss of the coffee machine filled the air between them, but it felt like they were the only two people in the room. "Lena," he said, quietly, not trusting his voice to carry much farther. She straightened slowly, stacking plates, her eyes still fixed on the counter. "I'm working, Ethan," she replied, calm but clipped, as if she had rehearsed those words for this exact moment, words that kept him at a distance. He hesitated, then leaned on the counter, lowering his tone. "Can we talk? After your shift?" Her hands stilled for a moment, just long enough for him to notice, before she resumed stacking. "Why?" The single word wasn't angry. It was weary, like a question she'd asked the universe more than once. He swallowed. "Because it's been too long. Because I didn't expect to see you here like this, and I just need to understand." That earned him a glance, brief but sharp enough to make him feel like she could see straight through him. "Understand what, Ethan? That people move on? That life keeps going without your approval?" The words landed harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to answer, but realized that anything he said might sound like pity or self-defense, and she wouldn't want either. Please, let me buy you a coffee. Just 10 minutes. After work," he said, finally, his voice lower now, less a demand and more a request. She stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether he was worth the trouble, then sighed. "Fine, but 10 minutes. I don't have the energy for more than that." She turned away before he could respond, moving back toward the kitchen, the conversation dismissed until her terms were met. Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers curling against the counter. That brief exchange had left him more rattled than any boardroom showdown. He returned to his booth, watching her move with the same calm efficiency, wondering if he'd already used up whatever patience she had for him. Still, 10 minutes was more than he deserved, and more than he'd thought he'd ever get again. The rain had eased into a soft mist by the time the last of the diner's customers drifted out, leaving only the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen and the hum of the old neon sign outside. Ethan waited in his booth, his heart ticking louder than the clock on the wall, until he saw Lena untie her apron and hang it on a hook behind the counter. She didn't look at him as she walked toward the back door, but the slight pause in her step was enough to tell him she hadn't forgotten their agreement. He rose and followed her out into the parking lot, where a single flickering street lamp cast a pale, uneven circle of light over the wet asphalt. She stood with her arms folded, her breath visible in the cool night air, eyes fixed somewhere beyond him. 10 minutes, she said, her tone steady but edged with exhaustion. Ethan nodded, shoving his hands into his coat pockets, searching for the right place to start. "I need to know what happened," he began softly. "I don't mean us, I mean you. Your life now." Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You mean the polite version or the real one?" He met her gaze. "The real one." She took a slow breath, as if bracing herself. "Fine. After you left, I tried to start over. Got a job at the library. Took night classes for a while. Thought I was getting somewhere. Then I met someone. He wasn't perfect, but I thought maybe. Turned out he wasn't the settling down type. When I told him about the baby, he told me he wasn't ready to be a father and disappeared before I could even finish the sentence." Her voice didn't waver, but Ethan could hear the steel sheed forge around the hurt. "So, I work double shifts here. I pay my rent. I take care of myself and this child. No one's coming to rescue me, and I'm fine with that." Ethan's throat tightened, guilt threading through him in ways he hadn't anticipated. "Lena, she cut him off with a raised hand. Don't tell me you're sorry. You left because you wanted a life I couldn't give you. And now I have a life you probably can't imagine living." The silence between them stretched, heavy with things neither could fix. Finally, she glanced at the diner's back door. "Time's up." She turned to go, but something in Ethan wouldn't let her leave just yet. "Lena," he called after her, his voice low, almost pleading. She stopped but didn't turn. If you ever need anything," she let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "If I ever need something, Ethan, I'll figure out myself. I've been doing it this long." Then she was gone, the door swinging shut behind her, leaving him alone under the flickering light, the mist clinging to his coat like unanswered questions. Ethan drove home in silence, the city's nightscape blurring past the rain-speckled windows as if the world outside had nothing to do with him anymore. The conversation replayed in his mind on a cruel loop, her steady voice, her refusal to let him apologize, the quiet weight in her words when she spoke about the man who had walked out on her. By the time he pulled into the underground garage beneath his penthouse, his chest felt like it was carrying a stone he couldn't set down. Inside, the apartment greeted him with its usual emptiness: sleek leather couches, spotless marble counters, floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a postcard-perfect view of the skyline. But tonight, none of it impressed him. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive, a constant reminder that all this wealth had bought him comfort, but not connection. He poured himself a drink, letting the amber liquid burn its way down, but it did nothing to quiet the thoughts tearing through him. He pictured Lena's hands, the faint calluses from hours of carrying trays, the way she held herself upright even when the world had given her every reason to bow. He wondered how many times she'd come home to an empty apartment, to silence as sharp as his own, and kept moving because she didn't have the luxury of breaking down. He thought about the child she carried, not his, but still a part of her, and therefore a part of the life he had once imagined. The realization hit him harder than he expected. She didn't need him. Not then, not now. She had built her world without him. And the only thing he could offer was the one thing she no longer wanted: his help. That truth dug into him like a splinter, because it meant he wasn't just feeling regret for leaving. He was feeling the ache of being irrelevant to someone he had once loved beyond reason. He set the glass down harder than necessary, the sound echoing in the vast, empty space. For years, he had told himself that leaving her had been the right decision, that they were better apart. But seeing her again, stronger, more self-reliant, and carrying a life inside her, made that narrative crumble. It wasn't that they had been better apart, it was that she had been better without him. And that thought, more than anything else, was what kept him awake until the first light of dawn spilled across the city, making the glass walls of his apartment feel like a cage instead of a view. The morning after their conversation in the parking lot, Ethan sat in his office. The skyline sprawled beneath the glass like a world he no longer cared to rule. His assistant had already placed a stack of urgent files on his desk, contracts to sign, reports to review, meetings to confirm. But for the first time in years, he didn't even glance at them. His mind kept circling back to Lena, the faint shadow of exhaustion under her eyes, the way her hand had rested protectively over her belly, and the steel in her voice when she told him she would figure things out on her own. It had stung, not because she'd rejected him, but because she was right. She didn't need a savior swooping in to fix everything. Still, he couldn't shake the thought of her working those long shifts, carrying that weight, literally and figuratively alone. The easy solution would be to cut her a check or pay off her bills without her knowing, but that would be charity disguised as generosity, and Lena would see through it instantly. No, if he was going to help, it had to be on her terms. Help she could accept without feeling like she'd traded her pride for it. He leaned back in his chair, the seed of an idea taking root. He thought about the women he'd met at charity galas and networking events, those who'd clawed their way back from impossible circumstances when given just one chance. What if he could create that chance for Lena in a way that didn't have his name attached? By noon, he was on the phone with his foundation's director, drafting the framework for a new initiative, a scholarship program for single mothers who wanted to continue their education. It would cover tuition, childcare, and living expenses, funded through a blind trust, so no recipient would know the source. Lena would be just one name among many, chosen by a committee, No special treatment, at least none she could trace back to him. As he sketched out the plan, something shifted in him. For years, his life had been about accumulation, more money, more power, more recognition, but this felt different. This wasn't about making amends in the way people expect. It was about planting something that could grow beyond him. He imagined Lena walking into a classroom, books in hand, her future hers to claim. He imagined her telling her child one day that she got there because she worked for it, because she never stopped moving forward. Ethan knew she might never realize who had made it possible, and for the first time, he didn't care about the credit. Some gestures, he thought, were meant to stay invisible. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn evening, Ethan sat in his car across from the diner, watching as the warm glow of its windows spilled onto the sidewalk. Through the glass, he saw Lena clearing tables, her movements slower now, her belly round beneath her uniform, but her posture still straight and certain. At the counter, a stack of textbooks sat beside her coffee cup, their spines creased from use. She was talking animatedly with a coworker, her smile quick and unguarded. And in that moment, Ethan saw a light in her face he hadn't seen in years. Word had reached him through the scholarship board. Lena had been awarded funding for a 2-year program in early childhood education, starting next semester. She'd cut back to part-time at the diner, and in the evenings, she'd begun attending a few preparatory classes. There was no sign that she suspected who was behind it, and Ethan intended to keep it that way. As he watched, she opened one of the books, tucking a stray curl behind her ear, completely absorbed. He thought about walking in, about telling her everything, that he was proud of her, that he still loved her, that the scholarship was his way of trying to make up for what he'd broken. But he stayed in the car, knowing the truth. This wasn't his chapter to write anymore. The life she was building belonged entirely to her, and the best thing he could do was step aside and let her live it without the shadow of his past hanging over her. A gust of wind rattled the last of the autumn leaves along the street, and Ethan started the engine, the low hum filling the quiet space around him. He took one last look through the diner window, committing the image of her to memory. Not the Lena he had once loved and left, but the Lena she had become without him, strong, independent, unshakably herself. As he pulled away, the city lights reflected off the wet pavement like 1,000 small beginnings, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. He had come here expecting to fix something, but what he'd learned was that some people don't need fixing, they just need space to grow. And maybe love, the real kind, wasn't about holding on at all. Maybe it was about knowing when to let go and being grateful you were there long enough to witness the becoming.